Hi, today we're going to talk about the cycling of matter. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So our objectives for today are to describe how nutrients move through the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem, explain the importance of nutrients to living organisms, and compare the biogeochemical cycles of the different nutrients. So, cycles in the biosphere. Natural processes cycle matter through the biosphere. So, unlike energy, which flows in one direction from sunlight to producers and on to consumers, if we take a look at nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, we find that matter cycles and recycles throughout the biosphere. So, matter is anything that takes up space and has mass, and it provides the nutrients needed for an organism to be able to function. Now, a nutrient is a chemical substance that allows an organism must obtain from its environment to sustain life and to undergo life processes. So, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, these are examples of both matter and nutrients that must be recycled in order for organisms to be able to survive. The bodies of all organisms are built from water and nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And we found carbon in all of our macromolecules. We found nitrogen in some of our macromolecules, and we found phosphorus in some of our macromolecules as well. The exchange of matter through the biosphere is called a biogeochemical cycle. These cycles involve living organisms, where we get the bio from, geological processes, where we get the geo from, and chemical processes, where we get the chemical part of the biogeochemical cycle. So if we take a look at the water cycle is pretty straightforward. We have evaporation of water coming up from any sort of large lake, ocean. So evaporation comes from the water. Transpiration is when plants release water vapor through their stomata and their leaves. So that's transpiration. So that's how we get water vapor in the air. Once water vapor is actually in the air, then we get condensation. And once we get that condensation, if we have enough condensation, we end up with precipitation, which results in surface runoff, ground seepage. We get our groundwater, which runs back into rivers, lakes, streams, where we can get evaporation and or transpiration again if that water is absorbed by plant life. Again, the water cycle, pretty straightforward. You've probably talked about it and learned about it multiple times throughout your schooling career. We're going to move on to the carbon cycle, and we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on the carbon cycle since it's going to be coming back later on when we talk about photosynthesis and respiration. So carbon, as we know, is the building block of life, and carbon moves from the atmosphere through the food web and then returns back into the atmosphere. It's also emitted by the burning of fossil fuels. So when we burn fossil fuels like the gasoline in our cars, we actually emit carbon dioxide into the air. And then we also have carbon sinks, where carbon can be stored in long periods of time in the geological areas around the world. The oxygen cycle indirectly cycles indirectly through an ecosystem by the cycling of other nutrients. So oxygen doesn't have its own cycle, but it cycles indirectly through the carbon cycle, through some of these other cycles as well. And the main processes are photosynthesis and respiration, in which oxygen gets cycled. So if we take a look at the carbon cycle, so here we have our carbon cycle. We have our carbon dioxide in the air. Photosynthesis is key for removing carbon dioxide from the air. And then again, plants carry out respiration, which puts carbon dioxide back into the air. We also get the decomposition of organisms, which ultimately creates our fossil fuels. And when we burn those fossil fuels, we end up putting carbon dioxide back into the air. Again, photosynthesis and respiration result in the taking out of carbon dioxide from the air and the releasing of carbon dioxide back into the air. And then we can also get dissolved carbon dioxide in water, which creates some of those large sinks that store carbon dioxide for a longer period of time. Our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle, and atmospheric nitrogen makes up nearly 80% of the air. So the air that we breathe in is not primarily oxygen, it's actually primarily nitrogen. And unfortunately, organisms can't use atmospheric nitrogen. So what ends up happening is we have certain bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria that are able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium, which can be used to make organic compounds like amino acids. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria take atmospheric nitrogen N2 and convert it into a substance that organisms can use. These nitrogen fixing bacteria live in a symbiotic relationship with plants, and these plants are typically of the legume family, meaning like soybeans, clovers, peanuts, pistachios, that type of thing. Denitrification is the conversion of fixed nitrogen, so this is what we would refer to as fixed nitrogen, into nitrogen gas, which returns back into the atmosphere. So we have nitrogen fixing bacteria fixing nitrogen into a form that organisms can use, and then we can have denitrification, which converts this substance back into atmospheric nitrogen, thus completing the cycle. So here's an example of the nitrogen cycle. So we have nitrogen in the atmosphere. We've got our nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the roots of plants and in the soil that converts it into ammonium. This ammonium then takes the nitrifying bacteria, converts into nitrates, and we can it can be used by plants, which then in turn get used by animals because animals ultimately eat plants and gets cycled as part of the food chains and food webs of an ecosystem. When animals and organisms die, decomposers break those down into ammonium, and we just complete that cycle that way. The phosphorus cycle is our last cycle, and it is an element that is essential for growth and development of organisms. So phosphorus is definitely needed in order for an organism to grow and develop. Now, there are two cycles of phosphorus. There's a short-term cycle in which phosphates in a solution, and they present only small amounts in soil and water. So when phosphates are in solution, you've got that short-term cycle taking place. And then the long-term cycle of phosphorus is the weathering of rocks that actually contain phosphorus. When phosphorus is found in rocks, it takes for a longer time for that phosphorus to cycle throughout the biosphere. Phosphorus is a factor that limits the growth of producers. So if there's not a lot of phosphorus available in the environment, producers won't grow. But if there is too much phosphorus in the environment, producers will take off and grow and develop, and you get these things called algae blooms, especially in aquatic environments where if we have a lot of phosphorus there, the algae will just completely cover the top of a river, lake, or stream, and the organisms will ultimately suffocate living in that lake or river because they don't have access to oxygen, or other organisms, photosynthetic organisms, don't have access to light because the algae has completely blocked it off. So here's an example of the phosphorus cycle. So you've got your weathering of rocks, weathering of phosphate from rocks due to rain. You've got phosphate in solution, so phosphate in water. You've got phosphate being precipitated in sediment to form new rocks. We've got phosphate in the soil, and then that phosphate in the soil can leach into water. This often happens when people put fertilizer on their grass. One of the main components of fertilizer is phosphorus. And when that phosphorus is used by the grass, or the grass has used enough phosphorus and there's rain or you water, that phosphorus can, through runoff, get into local rivers, lakes, and streams, in which you'll have a lot of algae blooms or plant blooms and stuff like that because of all the extra phosphorus in the environment. So after having completed this podcast, you should be able to explain why it's important to living things that nutrients recycle, describe 3 processes in the water cycle, and describe how carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus move from the abiotic to the biotic parts of an ecosystem.